She asked for space. I packed my tools and crossed state lines. 3 kids. 26 years. One secret that shattered everything. When she finally called, another woman answered. What happened next destroyed the life she thought she'd kept. My name is Clifton Decker. I'm 54 years old. I own a waste management company, garbage routes, municipal contracts, a fleet of 12 trucks. Not glamorous, but it's mine. I built it from a single leased truck and a handshake deal with the city 22 years ago. That business fed my family, put 3 kids through school, and kept the lights on through every storm that rolled through. Paula and I had been married for 26 years. 3 kids, Cole, 28, Cassidy, 24, and Finn, 19. Finn came to us from a county foster placement when he was 2 years old. The adoption was final before his 3rd birthday. He never knew anything different, and we never told him otherwise. Paula said we'd tell him when the time was right. The time never seemed to get right, and the years kept moving. It was a Saturday in late October. I was out back pressure washing the driveway, something I did every fall, one of those rituals that just stuck. Paula came out in her robe, coffee mug in both hands, and stood at the edge of the patio. She had that look she got sometimes, the one that meant she'd been rehearsing something. Clift, she started, using the short version of my name she only pulled out when the conversation was about her. I think we need some space. I turned off the pressure washer. The silence that followed was different from the ones at the dinner table. This one had teeth. Space, I repeated. I'm not talking about divorce. She shifted her weight. Just time. A little breathing room. We've been running the same loop for years, and I need to figure some things out. I looked at her for a long moment. I noticed she wasn't looking back. She was watching the tree line past the fence, like the answer to something was out there in the November bare branches. I thought about what my father would have done. I thought about what 26 years looked like stacked up against a woman who couldn't meet your eyes on a Saturday morning. All right, I said. She blinked. All right, you asked for space, Paula. I'm not going to argue you out of it. Her mouth opened, then closed. She'd expected a fight, or at least a negotiation. She'd rehearsed a different conversation than the one she was getting. I watched something flicker across her face. Surprise, then a quick flash of something harder to name. Maybe disappointment that I wasn't begging. I went inside, dried off my hands, and walked upstairs. I pulled my large duffel from the closet shelf and started packing the things that were actually mine. Work clothes, boots, the leather wallet my father gave me, my grandfather's old pocket watch that sat on my dresser. I moved deliberately, without rushing, without slamming drawers. Paula appeared in the doorway. You don't have to leave tonight. You said you needed space. I folded a flannel shirt. I'm giving it to you. I meant space in the house, Clift. Not. I didn't mean for you to go somewhere. I stopped and looked at her directly. Paula, you've been gone for a while already. I think we both know that. You just finally said it out loud. She didn't answer. The silence did it for her. I zipped the bag, picked up my keys, and walked past her in the doorway. Downstairs, I took a piece of paper from the kitchen drawer and wrote 4 words. Left it on the counter next to her coffee maker. Then I picked up my bag and walked out to my truck. The driveway was still wet from the pressure washer. My boots left prints across it as I walked to the truck. I didn't look back at the house. Not because I was angry. I wasn't, not really. But because some doors, once you walk through them, you don't turn around to admire on your way out. The note said, I heard you. Take care. It was the most honest thing I'd written in years. Sunday morning came in quiet. That particular kind of quiet that only exists when a house realizes it's missing someone who was always there. Paula woke up at 7:15. I know because she told Cassidy later, and Cassidy told me everything eventually. The fan wasn't running. I always ran the fan. She said the silence woke her before the light did. She came downstairs and found my note on the counter. 4 words. I heard you. Take care. My house, key, sitting on top of it like a period at the end of a sentence she thought she was writing. I wasn't there to see her face, but I know Paula well enough to picture it. That split second where the performance drops and the real thing shows through before she can pull it back together. She called me at 7:42. I was already 2 states over, sitting in a truck stop outside of Knoxville with bad coffee and a clear head. I watched the phone light up. Her name. Her photo. One from a beach vacation 4 years back. I let it ring through. She called 3 more times before noon. Then came the text. Where did you go? This is ridiculous. Clift, call me. each one a little shorter than the last, like she was rationing her pride. I didn't respond. Not because I was being cruel. I want to be clear about that. I just didn't have anything useful to say yet. And I've never seen the point of talking when you've got nothing that moves things forward. By that afternoon, she called Ron. My brother picked up on the second ring. Ron's a straight-line kind of man. No detours, no softening. She asked if I was with him. He told her no. She asked if he knew where I was. He told her if I wanted her to know, she'd know. She pushed. He didn't move. She hung up. Ron texted me after. She called. Told her nothing. You good? I texted back. Yep. Thanks. That was the whole conversation. That's Ron. Meanwhile, I kept driving. I made a decision somewhere around the Tennessee state line. Not a reckless one. Not an emotional one. A practical one. The way I make most decisions. I needed distance. Real distance. Not the guest bedroom kind Paula had probably imagined, where I'd mope around the house for 2 weeks until she decided she'd made her point. That wasn't space. That was theater, and I was done performing. I had a contact in eastern Tennessee, a man named Mel, retired trucker, owned a small rental property outside a town called Hartwell. Population, just over 2,000. I'd done some work for Mel's son 3 years back, hauled construction debris on a big renovation project. Mel had mentioned once that he kept a unit empty, rented cheap to the right person. I'd filed that away without knowing why. Sometimes you bank things without knowing what account they belong to yet. I called him from the truck stop. He answered on the third ring, recognized my voice, and told me the unit was available. $850 a month, utilities included, small porch, pond view. I told him I'd be there by evening. He said he'd leave the key under the mat. That's the kind of deal you can only make with a certain kind of man. What Paula discovered over the next 72 hours, I pieced together later through Cassidy and through Ron. The Netflix account. I'd cancel the family plan and set up a separate one in my name, a step I'd taken 2 weeks before that Saturday. Not out of spite, just because I've been quietly separating things for a while, the way you quietly start putting your tools back in order before a big job. The joint bank account had been restructured. I'd spoken to a financial attorney 3 months prior, not because I planned to leave on any particular day, but because a man in my position, with business assets and municipal contracts, needs his paperwork clean. The attorney had advised a trust. I'd set it up with Cole, Cassidy, and Finn as beneficiaries. My business interests, the investment account, the rental property I'd bought in 2019, all of it structured properly, legally, documented before any of this became what it became. Paula's access to the joint checking covered her basic expenses. Nothing was cut off overnight, but nothing was open-ended either. She went out to the garage Tuesday evening, according to Cassidy, looking for something, maybe answers, maybe evidence, maybe just somewhere to stand that still felt like us. Cassidy said she found it on the back wall, behind the old toolbox. Something I'd done on a slow Thursday evening about 6 months before, when I was out there alone thinking about things I didn't have words for yet. I'd taken my pocket knife and carved 2 letters and a number into the wooden shelf support. Small, easy to miss unless you were looking. CD, piece found here. My initials, and one line that said everything I couldn't. Not as a dramatic declaration, just as a note to myself that I'd already made peace with something, even before I had the language to explain it. Paula stared at it for a long time, according to Cassidy. Then she went back inside and didn't say anything about it to anyone until much later. That night, I sat on the porch of Mel's rental and listened to frogs and distant trucks on the highway. I opened the small leather journal I'd packed, the one I'd never written in before, and wrote one line. October 27th. First night. No noise. That was it. I closed the journal, set my coffee on the railing, and watched the pond go dark as the sun finished dropping. I didn't feel like a man who'd walked out on his life. I felt like a man who'd finally started living it on his own terms. There's a difference. A big one. Paula held it together for about 4 days. Then she started pulling threads. I know this because Cassidy called me on the 5th day. Not to report anything, just to hear my voice, she said. But daughters talk, and when they talk, things come out sideways. She mentioned her mother had been quiet in a way that didn't feel like calm. The kind of quiet that means someone is processing something they don't have words for yet. The first thing Paula hit was the bank account. She'd gone to the ATM on Thursday morning, and the number on the screen was not the number she expected. It wasn't zeroed out. I'm not that kind of man. but the joint savings had been reduced to a working balance. Enough to cover the mortgage 2 months out, the utilities, her car insurance, groceries. The rest had moved, legally, properly, into the trust I'd set up with my attorney 8 months prior. Long before that Saturday morning. Long before she stood on the patio with her coffee and her rehearsed speech. According to Cassidy, Paula called the bank. Then called our accountant, Frank, a man who'd done our taxes for 16 years. Frank told her he couldn't discuss the details of accounts that weren't in her name. She pushed. He held firm. She hung up on him. Frank called me afterward and said, in his flat accountant voice, "She's going to figure it out piece by piece." I told him that was fine. Some things are better understood slowly. The Netflix cancellation she discovered Thursday night when she sat down with a glass of wine and her remote. The streaming account had been restructured the week before I left. Her profile was still there, but the billing was gone. Small thing. But small things land hard when you're already off balance. The shared email account, the one we'd use for household stuff, school correspondence for the kids, neighborhood association notices, I'd forwarded everything relevant to a new address and removed my access. She tried to log in Friday and got a recovery prompt that went nowhere. She called Ron again. He answered, which I give him credit for. She asked where I was. He told her he didn't know the specifics, which was technically true. He knew the state, not the town. She said she needed to talk to me. Ron said if I wanted to talk, I'd call. She said that wasn't good enough. Ron said, quiet as a man reading a weather report, "Paula, he gave you what you asked for. I'd think real hard about whether you actually wanted it before you decide what to do next." Then he said goodbye like a man who'd finished a task and hung up. What she found in the garage on Sunday, I didn't hear about until much later from Cassidy. Paula had gone out there looking for something. She told Cassidy she wasn't even sure what. Maybe she thought there'd be some note she missed, some explanation longer than 4 words. She went through the shelf along the back wall, moving old cans of stain, a box of holiday lights, the socket set I'd been given 3 Christmases back by the kids. Behind a socket set, on the wooden support beam, she found it. I put it there about 7 months ago on a slow evening when the house was quiet and I was turning things over in my mind. Took my pocket knife and carved small, clean letters into the beam where the socket set would cover them. CD, piece found here. My initials. A date underneath. And that one line. Cassidy said her mother stood there for a long time with her hand on the beam. Then she went inside, poured out what was left of her coffee, and didn't come back out to the garage for weeks. Hartwell, Tennessee sat at the bottom of a long valley like something the highway had forgotten to pick up on its way through. One main road, a diner that closed at 2 in the afternoon, a feed store that doubled as a gossip clearinghouse, and a church whose marquee sign out front changed every Monday with a new piece of advice nobody had asked for. I pulled in on a Sunday evening, found Mel's rental by the pond, collected the key from under the mat, and stood on the small porch for 10 minutes before going inside. The air smelled like with smoke and cold water. No sirens. No neighborhood apps with passive-aggressive posts about parking. No Paula. Inside was simple. A bed, a table, 4 chairs, a kitchen with adequate everything, and a bathroom with a shower head that hit a little low. I could fix that. I fix things for a living. I unpacked what I brought, work clothes, boots, tools, the leather journal, and put everything in its place with the same deliberateness I used on job sites. A place for everything. Everything in its place. I'd run my business on that principle for 22 years. Turns out it works just as well for a life reset. Mel came by Monday morning to make sure the heat was working. He was a large man, moving slow the way men do when their joint have logged too many miles. He shook my hand, checked the thermostat, and told me the neighbor 2 doors down, a woman named Linda, had a habit of bringing over food when new tenants arrived because she said it was how her grandmother did things and she saw no reason to stop. She's good people, Mel said simply. Lost her husband 2 years back. Keeps busy. I nodded and said I appreciated the warning. Mel gave me a look that said it wasn't a warning, just information, and left. Linda showed up Tuesday afternoon with a covered dish and no apologies for the interruption. She was 46, brown-haired, composing the way people get when they've been through something real and come out the other side still standing. She set the dish on my porch railing and said she wasn't going to come in unless invited, that she just wanted to make sure I had something hot that wasn't gas station food. I invited her in for coffee because it was the right thing to do, and because, if I'm being honest, I've been talking to nobody but myself and a pond full of ducks for 2 days. She sat at the kitchen table, and we talked for 40 minutes. Not about anything heavy. About the town, the diner's hours, the best hardware store within driving distance. The fact that the church sign currently read "Worry less, pray more, and for goodness sake use your turn signal." She laughed at that last part. It was a real laugh, the kind that doesn't need an audience. Then she mentioned her husband, Gary, and the way she said his name had that particular steadiness in it. The kind that comes after you've said it 1,000 times through grief, and it finally stops cutting. I'd known her Gary. That was the thing I hadn't told Mel. Gary Sutton had been my closest friend for 15 years before a highway accident 2 winters ago took him on a Tuesday morning on his way to a job site. I'd been a pallbearer. I'd stood at a graveside in January wind and held it together because Gary would have told me not to make a scene. When Linda mentioned his name, I told her I knew him. She went very still. Then she said, "He talked about you. Clifton with the trucks. He said you were the most stubborn, honest man he'd ever met." I didn't have an answer for that right away. Just sat with it like a man sitting with something that cost something to hold. We finished our coffee. She took the dish back and said if I needed anything to knock on her door. I said I would. She walked back across the gravel path to her place, and I stood in my doorway, watching her go with something I hadn't felt in years, the sense that I might actually be in the right place. I went back inside and wrote in the journal. Day 4. Hartwell. Gary's wife lives 2 doors down. He always did look out for me. 3 weeks after I left, Paula called a family meeting. That's what Cassidy called it, a family meeting. In the same flat tone she used when she was describing something that made her uncomfortable, but she wasn't ready to fully judge yet. Cole drove in from his apartment across town. Cassidy was already there. Finn was home, sitting on the couch with his elbows on his knees, still young enough to think that parents calling a family meeting meant something fixable was about to get fixed. Paula sat them down in the living room and told them their father had walked out without warning and wasn't responding to her calls. That last part wasn't entirely accurate. I told her plainly that I was giving her what she asked for, but I wasn't there to offer a correction. Cole took it the way I expected Cole to take it. He was 28, broad-shouldered, built like his grandfather, and had always defaulted to protecting his mother in situations where someone needed protecting. He said some things about responsibility and about how a man doesn't just walk out on his family. I don't hold it against him. He didn't have all the information yet. Nobody did. Cassidy asked questions. That's always been her instinct. Not to react, but to ask. She wanted to know what Paula had said to me the morning I left. Paula gave her a version of it. Cassidy sat with that version quietly, which meant she didn't fully believe it, but wasn't ready to say so. Finn didn't say much. He sat there taking in the way he always took hard things. Very still, very watchful, processing on a delay. He was 19 years old, and he loved his father in that uncomplicated way that younger kids sometimes carry longer than the older ones, because life hasn't complicated it yet for them. What happened next, I didn't find out until much later from Cassidy. She told me Paula waited until after Cole had gone home and Cassidy had gone upstairs. Then she sat down with Finn alone. I don't know exactly how she said it. Cassidy wasn't in the room, but the result was that Finn learned, at 19 years old, sitting on the living room couch of the house he'd grown up in, that he was adopted, that the man he'd called Dad had chosen him from a county foster placement at age 2 and never once made him feel like anything other than a Decker. Paula's calculation, as near as I can figure it, was that this news would shake Finn's loyalty to me, that it would reframe our relationship as something conditional, a transaction, a paperwork arrangement, and redirect his anger toward the man who'd kept a secret rather than the woman who'd been keeping the same one. The calculation failed completely. Finn left the house that night. He drove to Ron's place and sat in Ron's kitchen until 11 o'clock, not talking much, just sitting. Ron called me the next morning. "He knows," Ron said. I said, "How is he?" Quiet. Thinking. A pause. The way you get when something lands hard but it lands clean. I asked Ron to tell Finn I'd call him when I was ready to talk properly. Not through someone else, not over text, but on the phone like 2 men who respected each other. Ron passed that along. Finn apparently nodded and said he'd wait. What Ron didn't tell me until later was what happened when Cassidy went through the house the following week, helping Paula sort through some insurance paperwork. Cassidy found it in the kitchen drawer, Underneath a folder of old-school records she'd pulled out by accident. It was a letter, dated 11 years ago, addressed to a company called Meridian Way Solutions out of Nashville. A formal letter declining a partnership buyout offer and a regional expansion contract worth, at the time, somewhere in the range of $400,000 in projected annual revenue. I'd written it at the kitchen table on a Thursday night after Paula had told me, plainly, that she wasn't willing to relocate and wasn't willing to spend more years watching me build something at the expense of the life we already had. I'd agreed with her. I'd written the letter the next morning. I'd never mentioned it again. Cassidy read it twice. Then she took a photo of it on her phone and put the original back in the drawer. She didn't tell Paula she'd found it. She sent the photo to me that night with no message attached. I looked at it for a long time. Then I put my phone face down on the kitchen table in Hartwell and finished my coffee. Some things you do because they're right. You don't keep a receipt. You don't expect the credit. You just do them and move on. But it's something else when your daughter finds the receipt 11 years later and sends it to you without a word, because she already understands what it means and doesn't need to explain it. I wrote in the journal that night. Cassidy found the Meridian letter. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Then I went to bed and slept like a man with a clear conscience, which I was. Paula made her move in the 6th week. I give her credit for holding out that long. She tried the reasonable approach, texts, calls, emails to the old address. She tried Ron and gotten a wall. She tried Gary the accountant and gotten a polite refusal. She tried sending a letter to the old house address, which was our house and therefore pointless. By week 6, she was operating on the particular desperation of someone who has realized that the person they expected to chase them is not, in fact, chasing. She called in a professional, a private investigator out of the city, a woman named Diane who had a website that looked like it had been designed by someone's nephew, but apparently came with solid references. Cassidy found out about this because Paula charged a retainer to a card she occasionally borrowed to order things online, and the statement came to the house. Diane, the PI, was thorough. I'll give her that. Inside of 2 weeks, she had a general location. Eastern Tennessee, small town, rental property registered to a man named Mel. She had a street address. Paula drove down on a Friday. What she found when she pulled up to the address was not a confrontation. It was my attorney, a man named Phil Garrett, standing at the edge of the driveway in a wool coat with a folder in his hand. Phil had a talent for looking completely unsurprised by whatever was in front of him, which is the most valuable quality a lawyer can have. He handed Paula a document, a formal notice, not an order yet, but the foundation for one, citing unwanted surveillance and contact following a clear separation of residence. It documented the PI hire, the surveillance, the drive down. Everything Diane had done had been logged by someone on my end the moment it started. Paula stood there in the driveway, holding the document. Phil told her she was welcome to consult her own attorney. He told her I was well, which wasn't her business, but he said it anyway, because Phil is also a decent man. Then he got in his car and drove away. Paula sat in her car in front of Mel's property for 20 minutes. Then she drove back. I was not at Mel's property when she arrived. I was at Linda's kitchen table 3 doors down, helping her go through a box of Gary's old paperwork, insurance documents, a storage unit she'd been paying for 2 years without opening because she hadn't been ready. She'd finally decided she was ready. I was the only person she'd asked to help. We'd been talking about Gary, about the way he'd approach problems, direct, methodical, no wasted motion. Linda said he used to tell her that a man's character was just his habits made visible. I said that sounded like him. My phone buzzed on the table. An unknown number. The one I kept for exactly this kind of contact. I looked at it. Linda glanced over. "You need to take that?" she asked. "Just a second," I said. I picked up. The voice on the other end was Paula. I recognized it in the first syllable. 26 years leaves a mark on your ear whether you want it to or not. She said my name. Just that. Clifton. Like she was checking whether I was still real. I didn't speak. I held the phone out to Linda and said quietly, "Would you mind?" Linda looked at me once. Then she took the phone, calm as a woman who had already decided who she was and what she stood for, and said simply, "He's not available for calls from this number." Then she set the phone face down on the table and slid it back to me. The line was still live for about 4 more seconds. Then it went dead. Paula called back twice. Both times went to a generic voicemail with no name on it, just a number. She didn't leave a message either time. I sat there for a moment after. Linda went back to the insurance documents without a word, the way a woman does when she understands that some things don't need to be made into bigger moments than they already are. Thank you, I said. She nodded once, turned a page, and said, Gary's storage unit is mostly tools. I think you should take what you can use. I looked at her. She wasn't looking up from the page, but there was something in the set of her shoulders that said, this is how I show people they matter. I pulled the folder toward me and got back to work. I called Finn on a Tuesday evening, 10 days after Ron had told me he knew. I'd waited because I wanted him to have room. When something that large lands on a person, the worst thing another person can do is rush in and start explaining before the dust settles. I'd learned that from my father, who was a man of deliberate timing. He never spoke into a wound while it was still raw, but he never let it go unaddressed either. Finn picked up on the second ring. Hey, Dad, he said. Those two words landed somewhere behind my sternum and stayed there. I'd half expected something else. Anger, distance, the kind of careful politeness that people use when they're rebuilding a position. What I got instead was just him. Same as always. We talked for an hour and 20 minutes. I told him the truth about everything. How he'd come to us, what the process had looked like, why we'd waited to tell him, what I'd always believed about what made a family and what didn't. I told him that choosing him had been one of the 3 best decisions I'd made in my life, and that the other 2 were Cole and Cassidy, and I didn't rank them in any particular order. Finn was quiet for a while after that. Then he said, She told me to shake me loose from you. I know, I said. It didn't work. I know that too. He asked if he could come see me. I told him the door was open. He asked when. I said whenever he was ready. He said how about Friday? He showed up Thursday night. I heard the truck on the gravel road just after 9 and stepped out onto the porch. His headlights swept the pond, and then he pulled up and cut the engine and got out, and we stood there for a moment in the Tennessee dark looking at each other. He was 19 years old, and he looked like a young man who'd been carrying something heavy for a week and a half and was finally close enough to set it down. I walked down off the porch and put my hand on his shoulder, and he grabbed my arm the way young men do when they don't know the right way to say what they mean, and that was enough. That was the whole conversation, the one that mattered. We went inside. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table until past midnight, talking about everything and nothing the way you do when the important thing has already been said, and now you just want to be in the same room as someone who knows you. Before he went to bed, Finn told me he'd done something. About a month prior, right after Paula had told him the truth, he'd sent in a DNA kit, one of the consumer ancestry services. He said he hadn't been looking for anything in particular, just that he needed to know something true about himself when everything else felt uncertain. The results had come back the previous week. He'd matched a woman in Kentucky, close enough to be a first-degree relative. Her profile was active. She was 41 years old. Her name was listed as Carolyn T. He hadn't reached out yet. He showed me the profile on his phone. I looked at it for a long time. What do you want to do with it? I asked. He thought about that. I want to know who she is. I don't know if I want more than that yet. That's a reasonable place to start, I said. He nodded. Will you be okay with it? Whatever I find out. I looked at my son, because that's what he was, paperwork or not, biology or not, 19 years of choosing him every single day. And I said, Finn, you finding out where you came from doesn't change where you belong. Not by 1 inch. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way men do when they've received something they needed and they're storing it carefully. Okay, he said. Okay. We went to bed. The pond was quiet outside the window. I lay there in the dark thinking about Gary Sutton and about choices and about how the best things in a man's life are almost never the things that happen to him, but the things he reached out and took hold of deliberately. 2 weeks later, Finn made contact with Carolyn T. in Kentucky. She was alive, healthy, employed, living a regular life in a small city about 2 hours from where we'd always lived. The story she told Finn, eventually and carefully, was not one of poverty or crisis. No dramatic backstory. No impossible circumstances. She'd been 22 and unmarried and had made a decision she described to him as the hardest practical thing I ever did. Finn came back from that conversation quiet and steady. He sat on the porch with me that evening and said, She seems okay. She said she thought about me. How do you feel about her? I asked. He looked out the pond. Like she's a stranger who made a decision that got me to you. A pause. I think that's probably the right way to feel about it. I didn't argue with that. I just handed him his coffee, and we sat there, as the Tennessee evening went purple and then dark. Two men who'd both found their way to the same small porch by very different roads, and were content to be exactly where they were. Paula made her second drive down to Tennessee 3 weeks after the first one had been met by Phil Garrett and a legal document. This time there was no warning. She'd switched to a rental car, Cassidy told me later, thinking that my contacts wouldn't recognize it. What she hadn't accounted for was Mel, who had been retired for 15 years and had developed the particular observational patience of a man with nothing to prove and all day to prove it. Mel clocked the rental at the end of the lane before it reached the driveway and called me before Paula had even parked. I wasn't there when she arrived. I was 2 towns over picking up lumber for a deck repair I was doing for a family in Hartwell, a side job I'd taken on because the husband had thrown his back out and the wood had been sitting in their yard since July. When Mel called, I told him I let Phil know. Phil's assistant called the local non-emergency line, and an officer stopped by to check on the property as a courtesy. Paula sat in her rental on the lane for 45 minutes. Nobody came out. Nobody engaged with her. She eventually drove back the way she came. What happened at home was slower and in some ways worse. Cassidy told me that the neighborhood had started to shift around Paula in the weeks after I left. It wasn't dramatic. No confrontations, no scenes. Just the gradual withdrawal of people who'd known both of us for 20 years and had done their own math. Our neighbor Roy, a retired postal worker who'd shared a fence line with us for 18 years and had borrowed my truck more times than I could count, stopped coming over. He'd always knocked on the side door on Saturday mornings when he had extra tomatoes from the garden. The knocking stopped. Paula mentioned it to Cassidy like it was a minor inconvenience. Cassidy didn't say anything, because Cassidy had seen Roy at the hardware store and he'd asked her quietly how her father was doing. The neighborhood app, the one the HOA ran, full of lost dog posts and passive-aggressive notes about leaf blowers, went quiet for Paula. She'd been an active member, the kind who posted reminders about garbage pickup schedules. One week she posted something and got no responses. The week after, her posting access had been quietly removed from the main thread by the moderator, a woman named Carol who'd been at our 4th of July cookout for 12 years running. Cassidy told me Paula had called Carol to ask about it. Carol had said there'd been a community vote about active membership requirements and left it at that. It wasn't cruelty. It was just the weight of 20 years of people knowing who both of us were and deciding quietly which version of the story rang true. Then came the discovery that hit Paula hardest of all. My attorney Phil had been working with a digital forensics consultant as part of the formal separation proceedings. Standard process, reviewing shared accounts, documenting communications, establishing a clean line between joint and individual assets. The consultant found it on the laptop I'd left behind. The family computer, the one that sat on the desk in the home office and had been used for household bills, school records, tax documents. Monitoring software. Installed 7 years ago. It logged keystrokes, captured screenshots at intervals, and sent a daily summary to a secondary email address I'd never been told about. 7 years. Phil called me on a Wednesday morning and told me, in the measured tone lawyers use when they want to make sure you understand the significance without editorializing. He said the documentation was thorough and would be useful. I thanked him, ended the call, and sat at the kitchen table in Hartwell for a long time. 7 years. The whole time I thought we were simply 2 people who'd grown quiet with each other. She'd been reading my screen. She'd seen the Meridian letter when I wrote it. She'd seen every email to Ron, every text I'd sent from the laptop, every search I'd made about the trust structure and the attorney consult. She'd known, on some level, that I'd been preparing. And she'd said nothing, just kept watching, kept logging. I thought about the silence at the dinner table, the particular weight of it, and I understood, finally, that it hadn't been the silence of 2 people drifting. It had been the silence of one person watching and one person being watched, and only one of them knowing it. I wrote in the journal that night, 7 years. Phil has the documentation. She knew about the Meridian letter before she ever asked for space. She already knew the door was open. She just wanted to see if I'd use it. I closed the journal. Then I went outside, split a cord of firewood that Mel had left by the shed, and worked until my arms were good and tired and my head was clear. Cole showed up in Hartwell on a Saturday morning in early December without calling ahead. He'd called Cassidy instead, which told me everything about his state of mind. He wasn't sure what reception he'd get from me, so he'd triangulated first. Cassidy had told him to just go. She said it in her direct way. Dad's not going to shut the door on you, Cole. He never has. I heard his truck on the gravel road at 9:15 and stepped out onto the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. He pulled up, cut the engine, and sat in the cab for a moment before he got out. I let him take his time. Some arrivals need a beat to gather themselves. He walked up the path, and I handed him a mug without a word. He took it. We stood there on the porch looking at the pond, which had a thin skin of ice along the edges in the December cold. Nice place, he said finally. Grows on you, I told him. He wrapped both hands around the mug. I said some things, after you left. To Cassidy. About you. I know. I didn't have the full picture. You had the picture your mother gave you, I said. That's what was available. You worked with what you had. He looked at me. You're not going to make me earn this back, are you? Cole, you're my son. There's nothing to earn back. He nodded once, the way men do when they've been holding a weight and someone takes it without ceremony. He drank his coffee, and I drank mine, and we stood there while the Tennessee morning opened up around us. Paula had sent him. I knew that before he confirmed it. She called him 2 weeks prior and asked him to go talk sense into his father, to explain that enough time had passed, that she was willing to work on things, that the family needed its center back. Cole had taken the assignment because he was 28 and he loved his mother, and he still believed that most broken things were fixable if you applied enough reasonable conversation to them. What he hadn't expected was to find a man who looked more rested and more settled than he had in years. He hadn't expected Linda. He hadn't expected to spend 4 days in a small Tennessee town and come back changed. Linda brought food over on Sunday afternoon, a pot roast and a pan of cornbread, and sat at the kitchen table with Cole and me for 2 hours. She talked about Gary, about the town, about the work I'd been doing around the property. She talked about Finn's visit and how the pond had frozen properly in the second week of December, and how Mel's gospel-singing neighbor had finally hit a note somewhere in the vicinity of the right key. Cole watched her the way he watched things he was still processing. Afterward, when she'd gone back to her place, he sat at the table with his hands around a fresh mug and said, She knew Dad. Gary was my closest friend for 15 years, I said. And she just ended up here. She was already here when I arrived, I said. I didn't plan it. Some things don't need planning. Cole was quiet for a while. Then, Mom thinks you came out here to punish her. I came out here because she asked me to, I said. I took her to word. That's not punishment. That's just listening. He sat with that for a long time. By Monday evening, he'd stopped talking about Paula's position and started asking about the property, about the work I'd been doing, about the side jobs in Mel, and the family whose deck I'd repaired in November. By Tuesday, he was holding a hammer, helping me finish the last section of framing on a small outbuilding I was putting up behind the rental. He called Paula Wednesday morning from his truck before we started work. I didn't hear the conversation, but when he came back, he picked up his hammer and said, without looking up, I told her you were fine. I told her you weren't coming home. How'd she take that? About like you'd expect. He drove a nail clean on the first swing. She'll get there eventually. He stayed the rest of the week. When he left Sunday, he shook my hand at the truck and said, Finn's right about this place. Finn's right about most things, I said. Cole laughed, a real one, and drove back north. The following week, Cassidy drove down. She didn't come with an agenda. She came with a casserole dish and a sleeping bag and 3 days off work, and she spent most of it sitting on the porch with Linda, talking in the way that women do when they're taking the measure of each other and finding the measurement satisfactory. I watched them from inside the first afternoon, through the kitchen window, and thought about Gary Sutton, who used to say that a man's real character showed in who chose to sit near him. I thought he'd have something dry and accurate to say about the view from my kitchen window. I thought he'd probably approve. The divorce was finalized in March. Phil Garrett handled it with the thoroughness I'd paid him for, and the discretion I hadn't had to ask him for. The trust structure held Cole, Cassidy, and Finn as beneficiaries, the business assets protected, the municipal contracts intact. Paula received the house, her car, and a settlement drawn from the joint accounts that left her positioned to live comfortably without hardship. The monitoring software documentation gave us significant leverage, but I told Phil I didn't want leverage. I want it clean. He got me clean. Paula's attorney pushed on several points. Phil answered each one with documentation. By the third session, Paula's attorney had stopped pushing. Paula didn't contest the final terms. I don't know what she felt about that, and I've stopped trying to reconstruct it. Some things belong to the person who lived them. The house in Hartwell, the small one I'd been building on a half-acre lot I'd bought from Mel in January, was finished in April. 3 bedrooms, a covered porch, a view of the same pond I'd been watching since October. I'd done most of the framing myself. With Cole's help on the weekends, he drove down, and Finn's help on the weekends, he drove up from the apartment he'd taken in Knoxville after enrolling in a trade program there. The housewarming was a Saturday in late April. Mel came. Ron drove down from home. Les drove down too, shook my hand in the driveway, looked at the house, and said good bones in the tone of a man who knew what that meant. Linda came with food enough for twice the people present. Cassidy came and brought a friend. Cole came with his girlfriend, who'd never met any of us before but handled the introduction with good humor. Finn drove up from Knoxville with a bottle of Tennessee whiskey he couldn't legally drink yet, but had bought anyway on the grounds that housewarming protocol superseded technicalities. We ate on the porch, and inside with the doors open to the April evening. The pond caught the last of the light. Mel's neighbor, 2 properties over, was singing something gospel-adjacent that floated across the water and made several people smile. After dinner, Finn stood up. He didn't announce it, just rose from his chair with his glass in hand and waited until the conversation around him settled. He was 19 years old, and he stood like a man who knew where he was standing and why. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what it means to be chosen." He looked around the table, at me, at Cole and Cassidy, at Ron, at Linda. "I found out some things about myself this year that I didn't know before. Some of them were hard. But here's what I keep coming back to." He paused, not for effect, but because he was finding the words as he went, which made them more true. Any man can pass something down by accident. It takes a particular kind of man to reach out and choose someone on purpose, and then show up every single day like the choice was never in question. He raised his glass. "Dad built this house with his hands. He built the other one the same way. I want to be that kind of builder." The table was quiet for a moment. Then Ron said, "That's the best thing I've heard all year," and raised his glass, and everyone raised theirs. I looked at my son. This particular son, 19 years old, standing in the house I'd built for him on a piece of Tennessee ground I'd chosen for the same reason I'd chosen everything that actually mattered, deliberately, without apology, with both hands. I raised my glass and drank. Later, after the guests had gone and Cole and Cassidy had taken the inside while Finn and I sat on the porch steps in the April dark, he said, "You okay, Dad?" "Better than okay," I said. He nodded, satisfied, and leaned back on his hands. The pond was silver under a half-moon. Somewhere down the road, Mel's neighbor had moved on to something quieter, a hymn maybe, soft enough that it blended with the frogs and the water and the sound of a Tennessee spring doing what Tennessee springs do. I sat there and let it all settle around me. The house behind me, my kids inside it, the ground under my boots that was mine because I decided it was, and I thought about the morning in October when a woman had stood on a patio and asked for space, and I'd given it to her in full. Best thing she ever gave me, that request. I just made sure to keep it.